Again, we always start with a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. And if you're tired of hearing that, every meeting that starts should start with a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, or we lose our personal liberties and the freedom of government. So we keep that in mind. I'm not going to go back and repeat them, but we may point them out as we come to them. Some of them, not all of them. Again, the Constitution of the United States provides a miracle of government that's never been known in this world before, a separation of powers. Legislative is the most important one. Everybody thinks the president is. The president is simply supposed to carry out what the legislative department and to report back to them what happens and recommendations. The president has some very important things like appointing ambassadors and things like that, but the Senate must confirm them. Now, we've had some very poor appointments that the Senate has confirmed. We'll get to that later. The third part is the Judiciary, which is the weakest of the three, really. It's simply meant to protect the people from the government. Now, people say, well, we must be loyal to the Supreme Court. We must be loyal to the Constitution. The Supreme Court gets our loyalty when it remains true to the Constitution. We're going to see that. So, the many things that the judiciary handles, and it applies all the way down to the judicial in states and cities. But that is where we are tonight, is on judiciary. The first fundamental principle is we are at war that started in heaven. The Savior is the commander of one force, and Satan is commander of the other. And because very few people recognize that, I see it find up sometimes in the writing. They say, well, there's an evil force or Satan, but most people do not realize. And if you don't know your enemy and what he's doing, it's pretty hard to fight him. But Satan, as I said before, attends every city council meeting, every session of legislature, every committee, every people. He's right here, and he's trying to stop me. But that's the first principle. We are at war, and since day one, among the children of Adam, that war has been continued, and most of the billions of people who have lived on this earth have never experienced freedom. Either complete dictatorship or kings or rulers or somebody that would allow them certain privileges and usually try to allow them enough that they wouldn't have a revolution, but never has there been a truly free people. Even in England, they were where they were founded on the Israelites, the people that settled England had come out, their ancestors had come out of Israel, and they carried many of the ideas, but oppressive kings overruled them until Runnymede, where Magna Carta was forced upon King John by the sword at his throat. Actually, the book says he did not agree to the principle, he agreed to the sword at his throat. And that was the way. And from that beginning, all through those years, 600 years ago, have developed the activities and principles which made it possible for the Constitution to be created. And the principles behind those is necessary to understanding of the Constitution. So, principle number one is war, and we have an enemy that's trying to destroy the Constitution. Trying to destroy the separation of powers, which is, once you do, again, you've got a three-legged stool, take out one and the others fall over. Executive orders went to be instructions from the president to his departments and people. executive orders have become legislative acts. Congress had 17,000 bills introduced in this session. There were 7,600 executive orders issued. The Federal Register, I'm not going to go into too much of these, but treaty law, the United Nations, which is intended to destroy our country. The decentralized government, where the federal government had limited powers. Article 4:18, limited powers. All other powers reserved to the states and to the people. And those were, the states' rights were killed with the 17th Amendment, because until the 17th Amendment, the Constitution provided that the state legislators would appoint the senators. They did not want the people voting for senators. All right, that amendment changed it where the people vote. They said, oh, you should get to vote for your senators, you vote for your representatives, you should vote for your senators. And so the 17th Amendment was pushed through by the same Gadiantons who put the income tax through. Those people worked for several years to get those two amendments through. The Electoral College, I want to mention that later. There are many ways in which people do not fulfill their constitutional obligation. One is abdication. The Congress has abdicated many of its responsibilities to the President. That's a legal term, abdication. Dereliction of duty means people who have a duty and are neglectful or wrong in performing it. So Congress has got two strikes on it right there. The third is usurpation, taking powers from one department to another. And so that's going on. The Bill of Rights, again, I'll just mention, the Bill of Rights expresses principles that I agree with everyone. But I do not believe it should have been made part of the Constitution, because the Bill of Rights transferred to the federal government the power over all these things, which without they had no right to rule on. We have lost more liberties and suffered more regulation under the Bill of Rights than under the whole Constitution. You notice that I could mention many ways, but the attack on the criminal system, drawing the criminal system into the federal government. I have a piece on local police review boards. They tried to put that into Mesa several times, and I led the campaign that defeated it. But it's anything that transfers state power to the federal government is unconstitutional and can only have evil results. The right to bear arms, they've been after that for a long time. First thing armies do when they go into a place is confiscate all the guns. And this army is trying to confiscate them before they take over. The protection of life, liberty, and property is the reason that we formed government. And government will protect you to a great extent it can, against criminals, robbers, thieves, all these things. But when government itself becomes the oppressor to further its own ends, then you're helpless. You can appeal cases of personal involvement of crimes against you, so forth, but you can't do much appealing what the government does, because the courts will not give you what you need. All right, so much for the sad part. The principle of the Judiciary and the Supreme Court, objective to investigate the trend of Supreme Court decisions in recent years and to determine their effect on the constitutional principles of our country. Thomas Jefferson: it has long been my opinion that the germ of disassociation of our federal government is in the federal judiciary. He felt that the federal judiciary was too strong. It was given too much power. It is not too strong if the curbs put on it. We'll talk later. But he feared exactly what was happening, that it became the most powerful element of our government. It is an irresponsible body. He said it become an irresponsible body, advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction, until all shall be usurped from the states, and the government all be consolidated into one. To this I am opposed, because when all government shall be drawn to Washington as a center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and we become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated. Many years later, he said this in about 1940, David O. McKay said, "Today we see hovering over the earth the ever-darkening danger of nuclear war. We are grieved and shocked when the Supreme Court renders a ruling that is unconstitutional for the government to require a belief in the existence of God as a qualification for government office. For 100 years, boys and girls in America felt they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, property. Recent rulings of the Supreme Court would have all reference to a Creator eliminated from our public schools and public offices. It is a sad day when the Supreme Court would discourage all reference to our schools to the phrase divine providence. Evidently, the Supreme Court disinterprets the true meaning of the Constitution, are now leading a Christian nation down the road to atheism. Traditional respect for Supreme Court judges must not exclude honest inquiry into the effects of the decisions upon constitutional principles. Our responsibility is to ascertain whether the judicial branch, as well as the executive and legislative branch, uphold Constitution principles. This is a quotation from George Q. Cannon of probably about 1900. The Supreme Court of the United States is a tribunal to which I have ever looked with respect and reverence. Its decisions are entitled to the greatest consideration. They carry with them the weight of great authority. High is as is my respect for the Supreme Tribunal of the land. My respect for the Constitution and my reverence for God are higher. I cannot assume for human laws and human decisions that which I must assume as God's laws. That is beyond question. So we're talking about some fundamental principles here behind this whole situation, that all government comes from God. Any government that does not come from God is not a true government. It's a oppressive government. The Supreme Court, prior to 1937, the court was established to settle disputes as to the meaning of the Constitution and laws affecting rights of individual citizens and sovereign states. Its job was not to interpret the Constitution. You say the Supreme Court is supposed to interpret the Constitution. It is not supposed to. That's what they claim. We have the duty. The Supreme Court has a right to lay a law beside the Constitution and say whether it conforms to the Constitution. And so this great respect for the Supreme Court does not include its right to interpret the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't need to be interpreted, does it? It was written plainly for the common people. The plowboys of New England, who would only go to school 3 or 4 months a year, understood the Constitution, its principles, better than most people in Congress or our lawyers today, because they were taught the correct principle of the Constitution. The Supreme Court under the New Deal. During the first term of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Supreme Court, a distinguished panel of judges, declared unconstitutional almost the laws he introduced. I won't name them, he lists a lot of them, that are completely alien to our form of government and our free enterprise economic system. Roosevelt's attack on the court. He vilified them. He called them a horse and buggy court, 9 old men. He tried to pack the court. He demanded of Congress a law to allow him to appoint a new judge for every judge 70 years or older. That would give him a majority and control of the Supreme Court. The Congress was still not quite that far, and they did not approve it. Congress passed a law permitting justices to retire at age 70 on full pay. 2 years later, Roosevelt filled 4 vacancies with his choice, 4 that retired because they were paid. They were political appointments without regard to judicial qualifications or experience or pre-societies. Now, I have a book written analyzing the decisions of Judge Douglas. He was the first one President Roosevelt appointed. He was President Roosevelt's personal attorney. He had no judicial experience. He had not been a judge anyplace. He was appointed. The Congress, the Senate, did a terrible thing in allowing that. I wish I'd brought that book in, because he was associated with the hippie movement, the revolutionaries. Much of his activities was with communist-led groups. He was associated with the leader of the hippie movement, a man named Rubin, the man who went around the country speaking at schools or any place he could. For children to defy your parents, steal from them. Money is a bad thing. It gives them control over you. Steal from your parents. Kill your parents. He just preached that all over the place. He stirred up a riot against the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. 100,000 hippies just swarmed the streets, smoking pot, yeah, terrible, and throwing bags of manure and smoke bombs at the police. It was completely out of control. Do any of you remember that thing? It was instigated by Jerry Rubin. Well, this analyst goes down the speeches, decisions that Douglas made, and the speeches and things that he promoted, and they were just like this all the way down. How on earth that man could stay on that court, I'll never know. And then when Earl Warren was appointed, then he and Earl Warren began to change the nature of the court, and very soon they had complete control of the court. Earl Warren, he became Chief Justice. The way he became Chief Justice, he was a very popular candidate for president in California. And California, as you know, carries more electoral votes than the state. So the other man that was running for president came to him. He said, Warren, if you will drop out of the race so that I can win, there's no other competitors, I'll appoint you head of the Supreme Court. He did, and he did. Under the Earl Warren Court, there were 100 decisions that favored communism and destroyed our Constitution in many ways. I cannot understand how Congress should sit there and let them do it. There was much protest in 1959, or Yes, 1959 in the Congressional Record was entered a great speech on the modern garb of tyranny, pointing out that the Supreme Court is imposing tyranny on the. It was done by a great scholar of the Constitution, and it was printed in the Congressional Record, and it would be a marvelous thing to read. Of course, we don't have time to read it. From state judges, growing attacks on the Supreme Court. Many state judges, including one in Arizona, made great protests, pointed out the things that were wrong, but the Congress didn't do anything about it. Growing attacks on the Supreme Court poison the judicial system, analyzing how the judicial system is absolutely being destroyed. The suppressed report, there was a report exposing all of this, and when it went to the printing office, they ordered it suppressed. It had to be printed, but what they did is put it in the middle of a big, long document where it would never be noticed. Well, I think that's enough. I could give my file on the Supreme Court. I've got 2 big fat folders on it, and since my printing thing went out, I've tried to select a few things that I thought would fit into the time we have. The constitutional references to the judiciary, Article 3. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Judges shall hold office during good behavior. This was so that they couldn't be threatened or influenced in any way. They were to hold office. Now, you hear the phrase, judges in the court are appointed for life. You ever heard that? Well, that's not true. They were appointed for good behavior. Good behavior was not defined as drunkenness or disorder or anything like that. It was defined as violations of the Constitution. Violation of the Constitution, they should be out of there. The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity. Law is written law. Equity is the many circumstances where you can't write a code or common law. To treaties made under the authority of the Constitution. People say the Constitution says that the Constitution will be the supreme law of the land, and states will be bound by it, and treaties will be the supreme law of the land, pursuant to these principles. I wish I had said pursuant to the Constitution, but you hear the phrase very often, especially those who are promoting it. Treaties are the law of the land. They supersede the Constitution. And I have an article for you explaining that I'll give to you next time. There are certain procedures that should be followed in any court case, either a legislative case, whether considering whether it's constitutional, or in a criminal case or a civil case. First is the facts. What are the facts in this case? Second, where are the witnesses? Now, I'm going to get to that a little more when I get to the jury procedure here, because the jury is one of the great parts of our judicial system from top to bottom. The principle that the guilty should not go unpunished. The innocent shall not be punished. So great is the Lord's concern that innocent people will be punished, that under His law, it is better for a guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to go to jail or be penalized. Because innocent person goes free only until he goes to the judgment, and then he gets everything that's coming to him. And the principal law is to know that there is a judgment. Remember, we had that as one of the principles of the purpose of life. And so any injustice that's done in this life will be settled at the judgment bar. And when you get to some of these Supreme Court cases and some of the jury cases, I can see a long line in front of the judgment bar. The jury, and I'll leave that till I get to it. I'm almost to that. I think I will because of the time. Some of the principles are, they're innocent unless proved guilty. And there is a presumption of innocence. Every person can stand there, and you know the law of the Lord is, and the Constitution, no person shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. When Jesus stood before Pilate and he said, "Why don't you speak?" Never a word. And we have that right in any trial. Say, I'm innocent unless you can prove me guilty. And that principle has been reversed largely, as I explained on the income tax, because the income tax completely reverses it. You're presumed to be guilty unless you can prove you're innocent. And so that principle has been lost. One example of Supreme Court interference is in breaking down the local police protection. If they can break down the local police protection, that gives the federal right, supposedly, to come in and take over. And this police review board, civilian police review board, is a program designed to take over local police departments, to show that they're inefficient, to make them inefficient. Federal government start just by giving money to buy equipment, buy radar, buy this, buy that. As soon as they take the money, they're obligated to them. The 10 years on the city council, I talked and voted against every federal grant of every kind, and 6-1. There was a case where a man with a rifle assaulted a woman in the most horrible way and killed her. He ran. They saw him. He ran into his mother's home, and they got a warrant, and they went to the door, and the mother said, "I don't have to see the warrant, come on in." He's in there, the gun, they caught him, it was proved. He was convicted. The Supreme Court reversed it on the grounds that he hadn't read the warrant. His mother hadn't, he hadn't, on that one little technicality. Then a similar one, the case where a Mexican raped and mutilated horribly and killed a young woman, and he was found and tried and convicted, and the Supreme Court reversed the conviction on the grounds that he had not been advised of his rights to refuse to speak. When the police questioned him and everybody questioned him, why, he said, "Well, I did, yeah, I did." And so the jury convicted him. The Supreme Court said, "No, you didn't advise him of his rights, so the guilty is canceled." Now, isn't that something? The purpose of law is to determine guilt and to punish it. The principle of law is that anybody who breaks a law must pay a penalty. If they do not, and society lets them go, then society pays a penalty. The abolishing of the death penalty for murder is one of the most terrible things done. And I have heard many good people say, oh, I don't think they ought to kill them, just to re-educate them, help them. Well, when you kill them, when you execute them legally, all you do is send them to the judgment for God to take care of it the right way. They don't escape anything. But in the Book of Mormon, when Alma said to the man that had killed, he had killed one of the leading men. At any rate, he was convicted and brought before, and they took him up on a hill to kill him, and he begged for his life. He begged for it. He said, if we would spare thee, his blood would come upon us. And if a nation spares all his children, that blood comes upon the nation, and you see it is coming. It is here. This is a bloody nation. And when the Lord removes his protection, he's merely satisfying that demand for justice. In the Bible it says, he that killeth shall die. Just as plain as can be. What more do you need? All right. Trial by jury. The jury was created to prevent the government from doing unjust things to people. Remember that? You think, well, the jury was made to catch criminals. Well, that's part of it, but that's the least part, because it is a tendency of government, no matter how good it starts, to deteriorate. Every government deteriorates either to dictatorship, where they maintain sort of order, or goes right down into total chaos. Lysander Spooner, many years ago, analyzed the jury system and wrote a classic, an essay on the trial by jury. This is a marvelous book. Nobody need go anyplace else in this book to know everything about a jury. And here's something that's going to surprise you. Chapter 1, page 1, section 1. For more than 600 years, since Magna Carta in 1213, there has been no clearer principle of English or American constitutional law that in criminal cases it is not only the right but the duty of juries to judge what are the facts, what is the law, what was the moral intent of the accused. That is also their right and their privilege and paramount. It is also their right, now get this, it is the jury's right and paramount and primary duty to judge the justice of the law and to hold all laws invalid that are in their opinion unjust or oppressive, and all persons guiltless in violating or resisting such laws. If you read and understand that, you don't need to read the rest of the book. It is right there, the duties of the jury. The rest of the book goes on and explains it at great length, and most of it is the legal aspects and things of that sort, which you and I don't have to know. It's interesting to read, but it goes through Blackstone and his great treatise on Constitution law and so forth. The trial by jury. Well, what is a trial by jury? What is a jury? 12 men. What few people seem to know, I read it very seldom, is that the jury system comes from the law of Moses. There were 12 tribes of Israel, and when anyone was brought up for a violation of a law, they were to be judged by the whole people. See, government is all the people. So every one of us, to extent, the judge. Well, you can't pack every courtroom with all the people. So from each tribe, they're chosen by lot, one man of good reputation and knowledge, get good man, righteous man, and pick them by lot. And those 12 men would assemble, and they would hear the case and try it. The elders of Israel, chief, would listen to them and guide them and help them, but the case was in their hands. That should be true in every jury trial in this country. You go to a jury trial and here's the judge. All right, he's not the judge. The jury is the judge. He doesn't make a decision. He doesn't determine the penalty. The judge has a power to overturn a guilty penalty, but no judge, Congress, president, or anyone has power to overturn an innocent verdict. The Lord is so careful that the innocent don't be published or be punished that he will go to every extent possible to keep it from happening. So if the Constitution were in force, people could walk the streets of this country with good conscience and have nothing to worry about. We have many, many people who are charged with crimes, business things, or family, or this or that should never be charged with. The judge is the referee to see that everything is done right, that both parties have full opportunity, that there be cross-examination, be witnesses. How many witnesses? 2 or more. The Constitution, 2 or more witnesses to every case. Now, I know a case where they had a person convicted of a very serious crime, and they thought they had 2 witnesses, but the last one, the witness was afraid and dropped out. They said, we will postpone the case, and when you get the second witness, bring it back. When the second witness came, the man was convicted. See how careful the Lord is to protect us, and how responsive we should be, how eager we should be to uphold the law, because what we don't want to happen to us, if we love our neighbor as ourselves, we don't want it to happen to anyone else. Basic principles. All right. Some of the process the Constitution provides, they have due process. Due process, a statement of the charges, very clearly what that person is accused of doing. The right to confront his accusers. Now, there are many people who will not report a crime because they don't want to stand before them, and sometimes very dangerous. We have gangster trials and very vicious people trials that they would get after a witness if they could, and many people are afraid. Yet that's one of the responsibilities. According to the law, anybody who knows of a crime and does not report it bears the same penalty as if he had committed it in the eternity. Pretty tough, isn't it? A public trial, it must be open to the public. Secret trials are not permitted under the Constitution. Counsel of their choice. The Constitution says that everybody accused will have the counsel of their choice. Today, many times the counsel are appointed by the court. Maybe it's because the accused doesn't have an attorney or doesn't know how to get one, but it's a common practice for the attorney for the prosecution. Well, the prosecution is always a government person, and the prosecution almost always is determined to win that case, whether it's just or whether it isn't. Most prosecutors are early in the study of law. They're getting their experience as prosecutors. They want a good reputation. They don't want to be known as poor presenters. How many of you served on a jury? Oh, wonderful. Think back of your experience and see if any of it fits in with what I'm saying. I've served on several juries. I won't tell you, take time. Very interesting cases. But I pretty well persuaded both juries that I sat on of the facts of the case and the principles. Now, no one has a right to tell any juror what his decision should be. You can advise him, you can present facts, but nobody in this world has a right to tell a juror what to say. He is the most powerful man in the world at that time in that position. His verdict can overturn the law under which it was made. In that circumstances, it doesn't void the law, but in that circumstance, say that law is not just, it does not apply, it was not violated in a moral wrong way. Oh, I love this jury system the way it ought to be. Then it got where, you go before the jury and the judge says, will you please stand and raise your hand? Do you swear to follow my instructions? Now, I stood up and said, Judge, I understand the jury's duty is to go by his conscience of what is the fact and what is right and wrong. And if I disagreed with your opinion, I would act accordingly. All right. Next, we have selection of jurors by the attorneys. Now, jurors are supposed to be elected by lot among people who are recognized. Now, were you ever questioned by the attorney, the prosecutor, the other attorney? Well, the jury has the power of nullification, the power to nullify a law in that particular instance. And so, again, it's an amazing thing, but that one person, and if that one person disagrees with the other 11, that one person rules the jury. Again, the Lord is so careful. He would rather than a mistake made that 11, now if he is wrong, then he has a penalty to pay. Now, when a witness stands before the jury, he is supposed to put himself as if he were the person accused of the crime and say, if I did what he did, would my conscience tell me it's wrong? And since I represent all the people, would all the people know that was wrong? Great decision to make, but he has that decision to make, and he should make it that way. They should have the power to subpoena witnesses. When you're before a court, it says you have power to be confronted with your witness, and if necessary, send an officer and bring him in if they have a witness that can favor. I've been witnesses in some trials on constitutional matters, and it's very interesting. Cross-examination. If you're not allowed to cross-examinate back and forth, you cannot be sure that you have all the facts. Testimony under oath. You swear before God that when I stand before the judgment of God, I will tell him I swore to do that. Judgment after evidence, and I've sort of covered that. Just compensation. They say that a juror should be just. When I served on jury, I said, I don't need to be paid. I consider this a service. They said, well, it's more trouble. We have to write the check. It's more trouble to unpay you than it is, so taking it. The purpose of a jury is to see that justice is done. You read in the scriptures that God is a God of justice. Justice cannot be violated one whit. least little bit. Mercy, and we're getting onto religious now, mercy is provided where on certain conditions everyone penalty is borne by the Savior. That's what Savior means. Anybody who does as he says, their sins are wiped away. He has suffered every penalty that anybody could suffer, more than you or I or anyone can imagine. How do you like to have a nail through you? Big, rough spike. Crucifixion is the most painful form of torture ever invented. The old one I think might be worse is to be staked out in a red ant bed. And the Indians did that with people. Just in case I missed them, God is a great judge. All judgment is an extension of God's judgment. Blackstone, the great legal advisor of England, said any law that does not conform to God's law is not a law. It's null and void. We talked about the person function. We talked about justice. We talked about source. We've talked in our fundamental principles that 43% of the Constitution comes right out of the law of Moses. Much of it comes on equity or common law from the Golden Rule. All right, the rights of man, Declaration of Independence. Well, I didn't cover all of these, but these are some of the influences our Supreme Court have had since FDR packed the court. Their purpose is to weaken the Constitution, some of them deliberately. One of the justices said, the Constitution means just what we say it means. Whatever you say doesn't matter. It has resulted in chaos in the law courts. Many of the decisions are conflicting. And that's because they go by administrative or case law instead of constitutional law. Instead of referring to constitutional principles in the case, they refer to case law precedent. And this gives lawyers much to do. They can study all the cases way back, everything, and pull out any case that they think verifies their selection. And so then the lawyers have Weinhardt versus Boo-Boo, so-so. The other one, no, Jacob versus Harrison. And they conflict. Much chaos in the courts because of Supreme Court decision. Aid to communism. This Justice Douglas that I talked about, that Roosevelt appointed first, was connected with many communist organizations. Roosevelt said, don't worry about the communists. Some of the communists are some of my best friends. And he said, we don't have to worry about the communists. We just have to worry about the people in our country disturbing our laws. Racial strife, the Negro question, the things they made on that have caused tremendous problems in schools and so forth. They usurped legislative power to that. The Supreme Court has made decisions which create new laws, laws that Congress never did pass. They have the effect of legislation. We talked about usurpation being one of the violations of the Constitution. Anti-religion, quoted David O. McKay on the Supreme Court is leading America down the road to atheism. And they're doing it deliberately. They know what they're doing. Now, occasionally there's somebody on the Supreme Court that will give an opposing. Many of the Supreme Court decisions are 5-4 or 6-3. Even they don't agree on what's right. And they should be able to sit down with the Constitution and point out this or that and show whether it was right or wrong. The Supreme Court should have the easiest job in the world, really, because their program is laid for them in the Constitution. They have many things to consider that are complicated in business and foreign affairs and so forth. Crime increase. everybody knows that crime is getting worse all the time, more and more and more. Much of it is due to Supreme Court decisions which have handicapped the police and the courts in prosecuting known criminals. Education. Next, education. On morals. The Supreme Court decisions, some of them have been contrary to the moral law that we understand. I failed to put up my chart on the jury, but just briefly review it. It was a trial by the country, 12 peers, a good report, chosen by lot, sworn to justice. They're a jury of conscience. They can judge both the law and the fact. Now the judge will tell you, I'm to judge the law. I'll just tell you, and you judge whether he's guilty or not. That's unconstitutional. Justice and punishment, I discussed how that failed. To protect the citizen against the government and to protect a minority against the majority. People vote their neighbors out of life, liberty, and property. Now I want to mention a couple examples of many that I could give, but I want to mention a couple. The great civil rights movement we had in this country. Terrible thing. It was communist instigated, and I was in that, and communism won't. It's worldwide. They're striving to control racial balance all over the world. Negro terrorism. They went among the Negroes in the South and created terrorism, trying to stir them up and get police action, so forth. Black Soviet Republic. The communists put out a book called The Black Soviet Republic, in which they picked 5 southern states where they had slavery and said, this is not the United States, this is a black republic. Nonviolent MLK, nonviolent. He went from city to city, working with the people in those cities, their instigators, their party members, and teaching them how to put on these riots in the city. He moved out of the city. 3 months later, long after he's gone, these riots would break out. And he was innocent. I didn't do that. But 124 cities were burned, terribly burned. If the firemen and police went in, they were shot at. They had riots such as I described for the Chicago National Convention. Looting in the stores, they just smashed the windows, and you young people don't know that, but surely some of you remember that, don't you? May not remember how bad it was, but it was. The war on poverty. The war on poverty is going to take care of everybody. You ever heard somebody say that he's going to take care of everybody? Did you ever hear it before you came to Earth? All right. All right. Lyndon Johnson, when he stood up to make his speech after he's elected president, he says, we are declaring a war on poverty. We are going to take from the haves and give it to the haves not. We shall overcome. Anybody recognize that? You know what that is? That's the communist. Americans didn't know what he was doing, but all the people on the other side knew exactly what he was saying. Well, some of the appointments he made to the Supreme Court are as bad as Roosevelt's. Grape strike, Mexican agitation. Now, I looked up my previous lessons on this, and this was back in the 60s where I made this chart. And at that time, we didn't have all this Mexican invasion, but I was aware of La Raza and some of these Mexican organizations that are in this country to take it over. I may have mentioned to you, La Raza is the race, in Spanish means the race, is created for the purpose of taking the Southwest back into Mexico. my sister and I attended one of their meetings, and I've got a little capsule of little pictures we took of it in there. And they said, we are going to take back this country if we have to kill them to do it. And that RASA has been tolerated by government. They've allowed them to perform in the streets and so forth. But at that time, I could see what was coming, and so I didn't foresee the invasion the way it's come, but I could see that that was one of the things that was in the process. All right. Busing for racial balance. The Supreme Court ruled that Negroes and Hispanics and poor races were not getting a proper education. There were some of them in schools, all white children here, and over their little ghetto, there were all black children. They made a ruling that schools must be equally balanced racially. Whites such a percent, blacks such a percent, Hispanics such a percent, and so forth. And for years, they had buses that would pick up the children and take them to school. If you had 6 children in your family, 2 of them might go this way and some of them the other way. You know. Now, many families choose their residence by a school they like, and it completely destroyed it. I'm not going to prolong that, but eventually Congress overturned it. But for several years, it was a terrible thing. And the other thing I want to mention is metric madness. Now, these two are 2 of many I could give, but I thought this might be interesting. People worked with Congress to pass a law requiring us to replace our whole number system with the metric system. Instead of dollars and cents, we'd have whatever they are. Instead of inches and miles, we'd have millimeters and miles and millimeters and so on. Milli means 1,000th of. And so 1 millimeter is originally determined by the length of the sun rays to the earth at the time they touched the earth, and that was as big as the point of a pin, and that was a millimeter. Now, the metric system has good use in drugs and chemicals and things of that sort, but can you imagine what would happen if it were forced on people? Take the construction industry. If all the lumber now, instead of being yards and feet and inches, had to be in millimeters and all these things, the whole thing would have to be changed. The whole system, the books and the instructions would all have to be written. What about our highways and streets? Think of how many million signs would have to be changed from miles. See, they didn't propose to just include this. They proposed that we abolish the English system. Now, this metric system was initiated by King Louis of France at the time he instigated the 10-month calendar. And that calendar caused so much trouble after he forced it on the world. And I think I told you that George Washington was born on the 11th of February on our calendar, but he was born when that other calendar was in effect, so we have him down as born on the 22nd. But think of having to measure all these street things in millimeters and this type of thing. See, the King Louis' idea was that tenths is evil. Tenths is good. Easy to do, figuring tenths. But it is wrong. Quarts, gallons, pints, pecks, bushels, all of these things coming from are very, very useful. They work fine. And so until Congress stopped this thing, it was creating havoc. Actually, mostly being ignored by people. I could not run a cabinet shop on metric. All right, those are 2 cases of insane rulings by Supreme Court. Now, that was not a Supreme Court. That was an effort. That was a bill in Congress that did not pass. What is the remedy? Is it hopeless? the Constitution provides exactly for handling a situation. The remedy is impeachment. If the behavior is not constitutional, the Congress has the duty to impeach them. You ever hear of Congress impeaching many of the wicked judges we've had? Earl Warren was the most evil, in effect, the things he did, even than William O. Douglas. Douglas was immoral and wicked and so forth. He had millions of dollars invested in casinos and gambling big on. He finally had to resign those because he had too much of it. The limit the appellate jurisdiction. I read the Constitution. Congress shall power such inferior courts as the Congress may determine, and shall have power to limit the court's jurisdiction. The Congress can tell the Supreme Court what you can do and what you can't do. What cases? The Congress can withdraw the funds from the Supreme Court. They can't withdraw their pay, but they can say, well, pay for your own lights and water. By cutting off the funds, they could bring them right to line. They couldn't operate. States' interposition. According to the Constitution, states can go together and interpose on decisions of the Supreme Court. No states have ever done it. They don't even know they can. I talked about appropriations. They can cut them off. Withdraw consent. They can, the Congress can withdraw consent and override a Supreme Court decision. Stare decisis, that means previous decisions on the Constitution. They abandoned that in 1937 and go to that administrative case law that I told you about. And resistance, all else the people should resist it. That was Andrew Jackson. The Supreme Court made some ridiculous decision, and he said, the Supreme Court have made a decision, now let them enforce it. And he refused because they have no army or enforcing power. All right, there are all the remedies we need. The resistance by the people, just if everybody in conscience refused to apply the metric system or to allow their children to be bused to school. Another principle we go back to is that the greatest reason for loss of our liberties is the ignorance and apathy of the people. We are the government. It is our responsibility. We're responsible for everything that Congress does, the Supreme Court, the Judiciary, and the President, Executive. And as I told you, when you turn 18, you have as much vote and as much power as any other person in the United States, including the President. Your one little vote is just as great as his. Now, he has responsibilities of office, but as a citizen, his vote is no more powerful than yours. So we have a responsibility to be alert and informed. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. In the remaining time, I would like to talk about the American Electoral College. How does the Constitution provide for the election of a president? You talk to somebody about the Electoral College and say, well, what university is that? But the question, ever since the Constitution was made, is, shall we follow the Electoral College procedure, or shall we go and let the people vote? You know, they say, you should get to vote for your president. Well, why should anybody else, why should just a few people choose your president? There's a reason why. But the fight against the Electoral College started before the ink was dry on the Constitution. because there were those who just did not want it. The constitutional provision for the election of president took more time than any other part of the Constitution. They argued they could not agree. They'd have many different ways of doing it. Some said the legislature should vote for them. No, that would combine legislative and executive power. And more than 200 proposed amendments have been proposed to change the Electoral College. None has been opposed because nobody could get enough agreement on any one of them. There is no other correct way. It may not be perfect, but it's as perfect as we have. How do we elect a president today? All right, we have the great Republican Party. We have the great two-party system. Isn't that wonderful? The two-party system was invented after Washington left office, and it has split our country ever since, because loyalty to the Democratic Party or to the Republican Party is greater than loyalty to anything else. That comes first with most of them. Now, there are statements, and for the first 100 years, why there are many, but since that time changed. But the Electoral College, they go through the motions still. You know, actually, you don't vote for a president. You vote for an elector who promises to vote for the president that you want. So on the ballot, it will have the name of the elector and the party. Well, how do they get those names? Conventions, great conventions. Oh, these great circuses of conventions and national convention. We have delegates from every state. What a great honor it is to be Arizona's delegate to the National Convention, where we hammer out the platform of our program and we choose who will be our choice for president. And that person becomes the person on the ballot to become president. Now, the Electoral College calls for a certain amount, I've forgotten here, men to be chosen in each state, and on a certain date, these men who have been chosen will come together. None of them can hold office. They have to be common citizens. They come together and they cast votes for the president and vice president. The Constitution provided votes for president only, and this I agree was a weakness. It says then they will take the tally, and the one with the most votes will be the president's candidate. The one with the second number will be vice president. Well, Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran into that trouble immediately, and so the Constitution amended to provide voting for president and vice president separately, and in my opinion, that should be done. But if then on this day they meet on the same day in every state, it's transmitted to Washington. The joint session of Congress, presided over by the Chief Justice Supreme Court, opens the ballots and counts them. If nobody has a majority, the Senate will take the highest three names and pick the president candidate. But why do we have this huge eternal election campaign? The election is not till November 2008, and our newspapers every day headline, Hillary this, Romney did this, and different candidates, always stirring the people up. Why should they even be bothered? Why should anybody care who's president of the United States? If the president of the United States strictly observed the Constitution, we wouldn't care who was president. You might say, well, who's president this year? Well, I forgot, I think. Well, how many of you can name your congressional representatives and your state representative, senator? You probably can, but most people can't. They don't know who they are. So it's not who, but what he is that counts. So the Electoral College does meet They go through the motions, but it's already decided by the popular election what names they'll have, Democrat or Republican. Total violation of the system. So we go through these terrible, expensive campaigns and conventions only to wind up with a two-party antagonistic system. So this book, American Electoral College, analyzes the convention and all the things they did, the reasons for and against, the different propositions they proposed, to show why the founders of the Constitution chose the Electoral College above every other system that was proposed. They approved it, I think it was 5 times. They approved a system and went back and said, well, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with that. They'd bring it up again. They'd change it, approve it. They'd go on to other business and bring it up again. They'd approve what had changed 5 times before they agreed that the Electoral College system was the best one. Well, we're down to that point. Next week's lesson will be on the education system of our country. And if any of your teachers in a public school, you might get up and walk out when I... Anyway, thank you all for being here. Class dismissed.